doing. So please log into our website and also on our Facebook. There's more information there. So just to introduce Isobel for people who are online and don't know her. Isobel is an art historian based in the UK. And as she writes, she's an occasional curator, but when she curates marvelous exhibitions. And she is the director of the postgraduate research at the School of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester. Her current research focuses on the relationships between institutional memory and contemporary art. The exhibitions projects that she has done, one of the highlights of today's talk was an exhibition she did in 2018 called Signals, If You Like, I Shall Grow, which was organized by the Gallery Kurimatsudo at Thomas Dane Gallery in London. And she is planning to curate the retrospective of an incredible artist called Cynthia Marcele from Brazil. And that will take place at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona in 2021. So Isobel, thank you for being with us this early morning in the UK. And we can start whenever you want.
Great. Morning, everyone. Afternoon, wherever you are. I hope everyone's okay. I'm really sorry I'm not actually there in Manila, but I'm really happy to be talking to you all and also to have the opportunity to speak to some of those involved with Eskwela in the near future. So I'm going to, now that the artist David Medalla has come home, in a sense, to the Philippines, and I'm going to speak about the exhibition projects I did and the gallery Signals London, which existed for 2 years between 64 and 66, and discuss that from the perspective of David Medalla's involvement and how that kind of informed my approach to the exhibition that Inti mentioned. And I'm going to now share my screen so that I can put up some images. So just bear with me. Oh, someone else is sharing, I think, at the moment, so I can't do that.
You can start.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, can everyone see that okay? Is that visible to everyone?
Looks good.
Great,
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry for the slightly awkward delay in uploading files, but we probably all got used to that over the past couple of months. So, okay, just to kind of begin in a slightly informal sense with the way I came to know David Medalla, or David Medalla as his English version is, or even Dave Medalla, was that when I was a graduate student many years ago, I specialized in Latin American art. And at that time, difficult to believe now, but the number of people in the UK who were aware of the type of art that was produced in Latin America in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you could probably count on one hand. And obviously that situation is vastly different now. So when I was beginning to research this area as an MA student, David, together with the curator and writer Guy Brett, were two really important people because they knew the work of that period. So as a very young, slightly shy student, that's how I came to know both of them. They would be present whenever there was an exhibition that addressed art from Latin America of that period, particularly Brazil. And so they were people I came into contact with. And I had also encountered the history of this gallery, Signals London, which existed for a short but very intense period of time, for 2 years, between 64 and 66. And both of them were amongst those who founded the galleries. So that's how I kind of came into more personal contact with David and with his work, was through this history. And when I came to write my MA thesis, I wrote it about an artist called Mira Schendel, who is Brazilian, and she was the last person to exhibit at Signals London with a solo exhibition. And actually her exhibition was prematurely closed because the gallery closed very abruptly, something that I will come on to later. So both of them were people who had the work, knew the work intimately. And so that's how I kind of became involved in both understanding the importance of that gallery as a kind of prehistory of the reception of art from Latin America of that period in this country. And that's how we got to know each other, talking about Signals, David's memories of Signals, and also just him being always very much out and about in London, the exhibition opening. And the fact that he has an incredible power of recall as well, and always knows the histories beneath the histories. So I looked at Signals and wrote about Signals for the first time in 2008. So by this point, its history was becoming a lot more well known, and there was a collection display organized at Tate Modern, which happened at the same time that they received a very large retrospective curated in the US, in Houston, of the Brazilian artist Elio Oiticica. Oiticica didn't have a solo show at Signals, but he would have had one if they'd lasted beyond 1966. It happened instead at the Whitechapel Gallery. And in the context of that exhibition, Tate looked at its collection, and it showed works connected to the Signals Gallery, including several that were directly acquired from Signals. And in fact, Tate's earliest Latin American acquisitions from the post-war period all come from Signals. And this was the first time that they kind of made that history quite visible in the gallery. So I began to, having come to Signals via Mira Schendel, I came to kind of look at that history for the first time in preparing an essay for the publication that accompanied Oiticica in London. And Signals has kind of, as tends to be the case with me, it's a preoccupation that never quite goes away and comes back. So quite a long time later, I was involved in a conference looking at the London art scene and different aspects of it, which became a publication called London Art World. And around about the same time, I came into contact with Kramer, who had exhibited David's work before and were very interested in the history of Signals. So this was a moment at which the proposition of curating an exhibition that would deal with that history became possible. It had been an idea that had been kind of bubbling away at the back of my mind, another kind of typical characteristic of myself. But this was an opportunity to do it. And so here's a picture of David in Manila, actually, with a tiny bubble machine, which Kramer and Zuto made. They made the scale model of every work in the exhibition, which now David now has. So I'm going to just give a kind of brief intro to the history of Signals London, so that I can show what the parameters were for that exhibition and how I approached them. And then after that, I want to talk about how my approach related to David's particular involvement in Signals, and particularly his role not only as a founder, artist member of the gallery, but also as the editor of its news bulletin, which is an incredibly important source of information, partly because there is not yet any organized archive of Signals. So in some ways, the news bulletin becomes a kind of surrogate for that. But because of his editorial style, it's actually possible to almost treat it as a kind of substitute archive. So it began not called Signals, but called the Center for Advanced Creative Studies. And at that point, it began publishing the news bulletin, which is like a folded newspaper. It looks like a newspaper, but it includes color and is kind of very well produced. It was largely funded because Signals operated commercially and non-commercially. It led to a lot of, as I've mentioned, a lot of significant museum acquisitions. And that helped them to produce this news bulletin, which was a very beautiful thing, which you can, for those interested, probably still just about get hold of the facsimile copy of the news bulletin that was produced by Innova in the mid-90s. So it was the Center for Advanced Creative Study because it was very much at that point in time, so 1964, it was very much informed by a perspective on the imaginative connection between art and science and philosophy, and also art as in the arts. So art, architecture, people's relationship with space. It was very much informed by a perspective of how the scientific, in terms of the hard sciences, and artistic thought and practice related to each other. And it took its name from a series of sculptures by the Greek artist resident in Paris, Takis. And this is a really beautiful mass display of the Takis signals that was at his recent retrospective exhibition at Tate Modern, subsequently MACBA. So it began not in its eventual premises in central London. It actually began in an apartment. It was an apartment shared by one of the founders, Paul Keeler, and David Medalla. And so that's where they began work. Here they are, like doing a collective mail out of the news bulletin. They also did their first exhibitions here in this apartment, and they referred to these as pilot shows. And this was something that I was particularly interested in as a kind of device. So the idea of an exhibition not as a perfect, overthought exercise, super professionalized exercise, but as a kind of experiment in itself. And often the pilot shows, the intention was that they were kind of rehearsals for a bigger project. And this was a very consistent type of activity for Signals, that yes, they did realize large collective exhibitions, but they also organized a larger number of these pilot shows. So all of them contain a kind of seed of possibility for an idea that may or may not take place. So I was really looking at these collective shows, and the idea of the pilot as an exhibition as an experiment that was about rehearsing an idea, but also understanding what would happen if you put different things together. And the aesthetics of the gallery were described as kinetic art, but Signals had a very particular understanding of kinetic art. So we might think of kinetic art as being kind of op art or mechanical art, but they really expanded this definition so that the movement could be real movement, or it could be just an illusion of movement. And they began to include works where it departed very far from the kind of very standard idea of kinetic art as machines and op art. So in Cornwall Gardens, they also used the balcony of the flat to show David's bubble machines, which I would have loved to show these outside in London, but it wasn't in the end possible. And this context of showing his quite early bubble machines on the balcony also gave birth to a really beautiful set of photographs by Clay Perry, Clay Perry is the main author of the photographic documentation of Signals. So again, the ability to kind of understand the installation of exhibitions there is largely thanks to the fact that he produced a lot of photographs of the activities of the gallery. So just a word on the other founders, and I will come back to the kind of dynamics of this a little bit later on. So amongst the founders, there were three artists. David, there he is, at the age of around 22, with Gustav Metzger on the balcony with the bubble machine. And there was also a third artist who is somebody who later on founded a new center for research between art and science, but then subsequently decided to kind of move on from the art world. And actually Signals showed a lot of artists who decided to move on. And Marcelo Salvadori was, in producing the exhibition, I was quite determined to show his work because, because of his choice really not to stay in the world of art. It was incredibly difficult to find any work. Even to find information about him was a lot harder than obviously Gustav and David. But he contributed perspective that was an important part of Signals, is that they were interested in the possibilities of new materials. So science and technological development meant that artists at this time were really fascinated by certain things that now seem like very standard to us, like plastics, and things like being able to get a new perspective of images of nature through microscopes and microscope photography. So this was kind of very much his end of the Signals dynamic. And also he made a lot of works that were designed to be integrated with architecture. So the image in this screenshot from the news bulletin is one of the works that's designed to be used as a window. So he also contributed this emphasis on the integration of art with space and with architecture. So while they were still without their own kind of gallery premises and working from the apartment, they also realized one of their, the first in the series of an exhibition called Soundings. They realized 3 editions of Soundings. They would have realized 4 or 5 in their plans for the future had they not closed. And this is interesting to look at because the selection of artists for Soundings was quite different from what was shown at Signals, or at least in terms of which artists were shown in solo exhibition. So it's actually, I think, the only group exhibition in the Soundings series that included the only other artist from the Philippines, although she was then in Paris, Nene Sagil. But you can also see there that some important artists for Signals in the future are also present. So they're early contacts, such as Takis. And David's role also was very important in kind of creating this network. So Signals was in London, but it was very much linked to other groups and movements throughout Europe. And because David had come to London via Paris, he carried a lot of those relationships with him. So he was very fundamental for the kind of social and intellectual energy that made him very good at connecting people and artworks and places. And this also took place at the Ashmolean in Oxford, the University Museum, but was realized with the support of the arts club of that university. So eventually they gained this premises, which grew to have 3 floors of gallery spaces. So it was a very large, very central space. The ground floor particularly allowed a really significant space for their solo exhibition. So they commissioned a lot of new large work via their solo exhibitions. And for those of you not familiar with the geography, it's a very central position. So it's sort of just behind where Selfridges is in London. It's really like pretty central, but a little bit behind there. And there were a number of experimental and significant spaces in and around that area at the time, including Gallery 1, with whom they had a connection. So Signals, particularly in recent years, given that there has been such a kind of sharp and steady increase in interest in artists from the countries that Signals engaged with, they're particularly recognized for their solo exhibitions. So they did a very large exhibition of the work of Brazilian artist Ligia Clark, who arguably is now the best well-known artist the most well-known artist from Brazil working at this time, probably amongst the most valuable in material terms as well. So the gallery was filled with a kind of retrospective, essentially, of her work. And their solo shows were more like retrospectives. They were pretty considered, and they wanted to present artists that weren't really recognized or known in London as artists that had kind of sustained and significant careers. So it wasn't just a kind of like small exhibition, but it was something that would allow people to understand her work in some depth. And this meant that these artists had a significant early critical reception in London. So it obviously played a very important role. And that was also consolidated by the News Bulletin, which operated kind of like almost like a catalogue, a post-exhibition catalogue. So David would gather together images and writings and reviews of the exhibition and put them in a special issue of the Signals News Bulletin. So this means that you're left with a really significant document, as much as it being a publication on newspaper. So another example there, one of the last solo exhibitions they did was focusing on the Venezuelan artist Alejandro Otero. It was, well, I wasn't there, but it looks like it was a beautiful exhibition, partly because it really kind of swerved away from his association with a kind of Venezuelan op art and focused a lot on these beautiful kind of quite intimate collages and assemblages. And again, in the final edition of the News Bulletin, there's a gathering of critical reviews of his exhibition, as well as other writings and sources that are brought together by David as editor. So the largest collective show that they did was Soundings 2. And this brought together artists in different places, but also different generations. So there was an important sense with Signals that they were working with artists who were fairly young, in different places, but they were also acknowledging their connections to artists from other periods. And in that, you can see this in David's continuing work. There was a kind of homage to Duchamp, to Malevich, to Mondrian, to Naum Garbo. So this exhibition really put those generations together. It was also the only exhibition that showed a work by Elio Oiticica. So you can see one of his glass bolliges there on the platform to the left of the image. But aside from that, so Foundings 2, because it has a news bulletin that went with it, was quite kind of known and recognized, but there was a lot more going on over these different floors of the building. And the idea of the kinetic was something that they started to kind of push more and more. And they wanted to disassociate themselves with this idea of it just being kind of playful, mechanical, quite basic kind of optical effect, and to add a different layer, both in terms of the aesthetics that could be connected with it, but also its meanings in a both scientific and philosophical sense. So they started, this is from the news bulletin, to describe it as the increasing sum of multiple creative endeavors. So something that couldn't be defined, but something that could just be added to. And the pilot shows bringing together different artists were a really important part of that. Yes, I love it, that statement. Yeah, so this idea that, and that drove the experimentation. The fact that, you know, they weren't going to limit, they didn't have a stable of artists, you know, they would admit and admit and admit, and include and include, and experiment and experiment. And this was something that I really wanted to emphasize. So in terms of my methodology, if we want to give it a fancy word, essentially what I did was identify, with the help of the news bulletin and some other bits of archival ephemera that I have, who took part in all of these collective exhibitions. And there was a lot of names. So even before they opened the gallery, they had what they called a Festival of Modern Art from Latin America, which included so many artists that they had to do in 2 phases. They also had plans that didn't happen, so I just included those as well, in the spirit of Medalla, which I will say more about in a minute. And also they had, on the top floor, they had a kind of showroom there, and there were other artists that were shown in that space. So essentially I made a map of all these collective exhibitions beyond the ones that are kind of were larger and more well known, and just found out who else was kind of in and around of interest to the group. So I began with a very long list of artists, some of whom are not so super recognized as Alicia Clark, Mira Schendel, and the other artists that were given solo exhibitions. So fortunately, in working collaboration with Kuru Mansuto and later with Thomas Dane, they were sympathetic to this idea, because I suppose it would have been quite straightforward to focus on the particularly Latin American artists involved, which was heavily weighted towards Brazil and Venezuela. But I really wanted to capture the fact that they were kind of testing out ideas through exhibitions, and also that they were pretty wide in terms of the artists that interested them, and that they wanted to support through exhibitions. So I began with this kind of extraordinary constellation of names, and then introduced a level of organization to that. And one of the things I was really interested in was this idea of the invisible. So they sort of started to move away from the idea of the kinetic, because it brought associations that weren't necessarily expansive enough, towards the idea of the invisible, which would allow a really broad set of associations to come to the fore, and also a lot of very different types of practices. So they realized a series of pilot shows for Towards the Invisible, but actually the idea was that they would have done another large exhibition on the scale, at least, of Soundings 2 about this idea of the invisible. But they didn't reach that point, but they rehearsed and experimented with it. So they had various titles for their pilot shows. Initially it was Tomorrow Today, and then it became Towards the Invisible. And it's an interesting point with this is that the reception of, or the understanding of signals has been very focused on Latin America, and it was absolutely a significant pole of their interest. But they're also not excluding, I mean, excluding is maybe not the best word to use for a very kind of prominent country, but they also did have significant links with the USA and an interest in how particularly artists associated with abstract expressionism might be brought into a different relationship with this idea of the invisible. So they had contacts in the US, both with people working in New York, but also with a much more kind of scattered kinetic practice that wasn't necessarily in the most central parts of the US. So they didn't kind of have borders. There was they weren't fans of pop art, but certainly they saw in abstract expressionism a type of language, both kind of in terms of the use of paint, but also the images that might be produced that was really compatible with their focus on art from other parts of the world. And they also, and this became a bit of a focus for the exhibition, they did manage to organize the third edition of Soundings, which interestingly was entirely focused on art in Britain and on kinetic artists in Britain. And one of the things that is really interesting about this exhibition is that it included very well-known artists, so Mary Martin, for instance, but it also extended to different parts of England. So at this time, it says something a little bit about what was possible in England at that time, because there were a number of independent experimental schools of art. There were different centers for experimental activity, and Signals was connected to them as well. So they had an interesting topography in terms of the UK as well, in that they weren't kind of London-centric. They were very, very connected, and they kept an eye on what was happening in other cities or art schools, and likewise, they invited artists in. So Soundings 3, which is the British kind of kinetic art show, hadn't really been noticed very much, partly because it was one of the last ones, so there was no news bulletin to kind of reflect and document it. So I also dug into that show and came up with my list of names from that as well. And just a note, I mean, one of the significant legacies, if you like, of this exhibition was this incredible work which Mary Martin made especially for that show, which was acquired via donation by Tate in 1970. So it's another part of Signals history that's kind of left its mark on national collections in the UK. And yeah, the unrealized plan. So I have an invite card from '66 that shows what they would have done, and I was very much interested in what they would have done or may have done. So I wasn't even attempting to produce some kind of detailed, accurate reconstruction of what the exhibitions were that took place. I was interested in how they had numerous kind of unrealized ideas, the sense that everything, the kind of speed and intensity in which they did things with care, but with urgency, also meant that other things might have been possible. So this was my attitude with the exhibition. I didn't think that signals was something that could be reconstructed, and neither did I want to do anything exhaustive or that would kind of exhaust that history and its potential. So that was my approach, and I was very glad that it was supported, rather than, you know, I could have just put all the well-known artists, but I really didn't want to do that, and luckily they let me get away with it. So just to give you a quick walk through the show, so eventually we went through various ideas, the possibility of being able to do it in an apartment in Cornwall Gardens, lots of dreams and schemes. But in the end, we established a partnership with Thomas Dane, who had quite a long-term interest in some of the artists connected, as well as a good relationship with Kramer and Otero. And there are 2 spaces in that gallery, so we broadly divided the exhibition into, in the first space, the founder artists of Signal, and also the artists that had been particularly significant to them early on. So here is a picture of the central space, and you can see Medalla's sand machine there, and also these beautiful collage works by Otero. And then looking through here, that work in the foreground is by an artist called Harry Kramer, who was present in their first Soundings One exhibition and in a number of their collective shows, and has quite an extraordinary biography. So he was essentially a hairdresser, a dancer, and an acrobat, but he also made kinetic art. And his first large exhibition in Germany was curated by Harold Seaman. And there are actually a couple of his works in Tate, which they're restoring now, which is another nice legacy of this show. And it was really kind of quite a scene stealer for the exhibition, because he makes these beautiful moving works. So looking through here, in the background of this image is the work by Salvadori that we were able to find. And you also see here, and in this space, works by artists from some of the European movements that they were connected to in Germany and in Italy, and of course one of Taki's signals, a very tall one, and so there was a nice kind of sense in this room. The Harry Kramer works, when they move, make a really beautiful noise, and then we had signals flashing in this space. And here is the Salvadori work. So this room kind of had Salvadori together with David. The work hadn't seen the light of day for a very, very long time. Ideally, it will be shown, I would say, kind of within a niche in the wall, because it was designed to be something you look through, almost like a window. And of course, David's famous bubble machine, which is a kind of interesting process in itself, just learning how they work. They look very simple. They use detergent, but they only work with the type of detergent that was used at the time they were made. So it was a really kind of intense process working with the installers and various other people, and Adam, David's collaborator, to make this work. But it was a real joy. And we showed this together with some drawings by the artist Len Lai, originally from New Zealand, but who spent a significant amount of time working in Britain, and is particularly known for his experimental films. And we showed drawings of some of his kind of amazing imaginary machines. And obviously, as everyone comments, we showed Lisha Clark, but nothing like what was possible in 1965 to be sitting on the floor surrounded by these beautiful, movable Bishu works. So obviously, there were certain impossibilities with showing the works in the way they were shown at Signals. And for Metzger, it was a little bit tricky to kind of think about how his work could be exhibited in this context. At Signals, he was involved in the autodestructive art movement. He didn't exhibit work as such, but his works were screened. So he was present, but probably the more challenging person to represent. And with Elioita and you can see in the foreground here, one of the few glass Bolide works which are left in existence, because unfortunately a lot of them were destroyed in a fire in Rio. And we were able to show this, which was one that's in Tate's collection, which actually someone who visited the exhibition commented that it made this beautiful relationship with Metzger, because it kind of looks like it looks like a Molotov cocktail. So it had this kind of really nice relationship between Metzger's idea of destruction as creation. And some of the artists that we selected, I should say, included some that hadn't shown at Signals. So an artist called Lily Greenham, who originally from Austria, then came to London, then left London halfway through Signals, is also an amazing experimental sound and voice poet. But her work, the V&A had a work by Lily Greenham, which is on the back wall to the left here, the longer work, which I don't think had ever exhibited before. So it was a really nice opportunity to just feed certain artists within the exhibition. And then we also presented one of her sound poems in the other space, which I'll move on to. So a little bit down the road is an entirely different space, as part of Thomas Thing Gallery. And this is where the focus was on, particularly on the later group exhibition. So the idea of Towards the Invisible. It was a very kind of monochrome but energetic space with this beautiful moving work by Gianni Colombo, and also works by Mira Schendel, together with Li Wanxia, who was someone she met and collaborated with through Signals. There we are, there's Li and Mira together. And some really beautiful works by the Italian artist Caldarara, and one of the Towards the Invisible pilots was a solo show of these very beautiful, delicate works. Caldarara himself was also linked to Li Wanxia, so I was also trying to kind of indicate some of these connections. And then the final room, all of the artists in this room were British artists that showed in Soundings 3. And also as a central feature of this work, the artist Jean Alte designed this space station, which was essentially somewhere where people could sit down and look at archived material. So we had various types of material there, the facsimile news bulletin, different books that allow people to understand more about Signals, but also about the particular artist in this room. So this really added a kind of structure to the space, but also just meant that people could sit down. And I suppose particularly in a commercial gallery context, it doesn't always happen. So it was nice when the exhibition was opened, it drew out some people who'd kind of been around at the time, some of the artists who'd exhibited, and they could come in here and look at various types of materials. There's some quite precious archive material, but also some kind of visual culture of the period. So some of the British artists had also worked as graphic designers. So we showed different kinds of material there. including some archive material from the Autodestructive Art Museum. Movement. So again, this was a moment in which Metzger was kind of reintroduced into the picture. I'm going to say a little bit more about Medalla and Metzger. I should speed up a bit. So Medalla's news bulletin. So he was, as I said, the editor and creator of this. He's commented that sometimes it happened very, very quickly, under pressure to kind of get it designed, get it assembled, get it printed, get it out. But nevertheless, it's a really exquisite object, and its content is also very exquisite. Every time I open it, I see something I have not noticed before. So that's kind of what the experience of reading it is like. And as I say, the idea of signals at the outset was very interdisciplinary. It was about this imaginative connection with science, with architecture, engineering, new materials and the science of materials. So that meant that there was this kind of interplay between visual art and science, and a lot of connections that David made through found photographs and images of artists. So this is a relief by the Brazilian artist Sérgio de Camargo, which he's put together with a picture of birds in flight. And throughout, you see these visual associations being made between scientific images and images of artwork. And likewise, there was a regular column by the editor of the New Scientist, John Newell, on science, on scientific development, often illustrated with images from art. So all of these kind of associations were put into place by the news bulletin. And something that was also really, really important in terms of how the news bulletin is vital to me for understanding signals, is that David Medalla was very good at tracking relationships via the news bulletin. So he would say how people knew each other, he would say who'd visited, and it's very representative. This is something that Guy Brett, who was also a founder member and a very young art critic for the Times at the time, he was also 22 years old, that he, part of what he does, part of his practice, but not in a kind of self-conscious way, is putting people together, even persuading people who are not artists that they are artists, for example, and creating groups. So you can imagine this said how important his particular approach to life and to people was for allowing signals to become what it was. So, for example, he would add these kind of typed notes explaining how people entered the signals network. So he would make sure that it was known that they knew Elliot Oiticica's work via Leisure Clark, that they knew Mira Schendel's work via Sérgio de Camargo, that Keeler knew about Takis and Soto and Paul Bury and Chilada by David, and so on. So there's all these kind of like tracks and traces left throughout the news bulletin that allow you to understand these connections. But it wasn't just kind of dropping names. So there's a little note on the back of one of the issues about painting the new showrooms on the 3rd floor, where David has also mentioned just everyone who helped with that. And so some of them are people who are artists and kind of known. Other people are just people from other places who came and helped. So he would acknowledge kind of the everyday life and events that happened. He would mention kind of what was happening with the families of artists who came. He'd be equally as interested in an artist's love of music as their work. So these kind of relationships are scattered throughout the whole news bulletin. And he also used the news bulletin to publish his own works, including ones that are sort of not that well known now, and that were made as tributes to particular artists involved in signals. So this is a rice machine that he made as a homage to Mira Schendel, which appears in the news bulletin. And there's a number also of his found poems. So this is a found image, which is a catalogue of tools, which he turned into a found poem for Otero. So some of Otero's works that were shown at Signals were these very beautiful white on white assemblages with a particular tool on the surface of a white piece of board, and then kind of painted over in white. So he published within the news bulletin this found poem for Otero. Also this found poem image for Taki's Signal. So he's got this picture of a crane, and then he's put Signals London on it. The numerous kind of little, not little, but there are quite a few works that are David's work in the sense of being works of art in themselves throughout the news bulletin. And also something really important, and this is just a couple of examples, is that it contained a lot of poetry. Both David and also Guy Brett were very interested in poetry. They also started a kind of, they called it their own poet corner, where they would have collections of poetry and readings within Signals. And it really did, once it reached 3 floors, it had quite a kind of complex possibilities for different types of things to be happening. So screening films, but also poetry reading. So the news bulletin is filled with poetry as well. This is a really, I don't know what the word is. I just like it a lot. It's an ode to Soto's Moustache by a British experimental poet called John Furnival, which begins with Soto's moustache and then kind of creates all these different word plays underneath it. And then a visual poem that's a homage to Taki. So in getting to understand a little bit more about why Signals didn't last forever, my understanding of it is very much to do with its time. So it took place at a moment which almost seems like it's the exact hinge or seesaw or tipping point between 2 very different attitudes to contemporary artistic practice. So as I've indicated, and as David has said himself and others, when Signals opened, they were pretty optimistic in terms of the relationship between art and science and technology, in terms of what was happening in different parts of the world. So at this time, I mean, Venezuela was really kind of seen as somewhere that was pioneering in terms of architecture, in terms of art, experiencing a very different moment than it is now. And it was widely depicted as such in the UK. So it was seen as being a utopian place. It was seen as being a city of the future, a country of the future. So this was in terms of the surrounding associations that both Brazil and Venezuela would have in London at this time. Brazil also was drawing similar attention after the construction of Brasilia, for example, of being a kind of place of the future. And their relationship with Brazil developed after they went there for the first time. They knew from Brazil the kind of extraordinary developments that had been made in theoretical physics, in early computer technology. So their understanding of these countries was very much of that time. And then even though the military coup had occurred in Brazil in 1964. It was a moment prior to the severity that was made very apparent by the passing of certain security legislation. And also, I suppose that the understanding of that reality was different to how it might be today, in that there's a certain delay in terms of now we understand what is happening in other places quite quickly. Then their perspective on Brazil was not an awareness of what was occurring politically. So there was, at this moment, an optimistic beginning to the gallery, to the project, to their attitude towards art and science. And there are particular articles that David chose to republish that kind of indicate this tension between what's possible and what the negative consequences might be. So one of them was this reprint of Heisenberg's The Role of Modern Physics in the Present Development of Human Thinking, which is essentially Heisenberg's philosophical take on the change in the paradigm shift in physics. So being able to understand the world in terms of connection, relativity and at a different scale, the way that that is associated also with philosophies that relate to the world in that way, particularly Buddhism. But in his introduction to this, he does also acknowledge that that potential for new physics at one end was kind of possibility, relativity, connectivity, complexity, and at the other end it was the atom bomb. And at that time, I would say that the majority of the members of Signals were on the possibility, probability, interconnectivity side, apart from Metzger. For Metzger, it was the bomb. And so there was a real tension, in some sense, in the founding of Signals between Metzger, who was much more of an activist in his approach and much more critical of scientific and technological development. Salvatore, who was interested in technology in terms of materials and possibilities. David, who was interested in it imaginatively, philosophically. And eventually, inevitably, as political developments became a lot more apparent, this tension, or the optimistic side of it, had to turn into something else. So this is sort of part of the climate of Signals closure. And another decisive moment was that David chose to republish two articles, so this by Lewis Mumford, and also a letter from the poet Robert Lowell about Vietnam, that were critical of Vietnam. And you can see again, he's put in an image of a Buddhist temple next to this, so he's still using these kind of associations and juxtapositions. So it was really the first kind of decisively political thing that the News Bulletin did, and it is potentially part of the reason why Paul Keeler's father, whose building they were occupying, who supported the gallery financially, decided to discontinue his financial support. Probably, I don't know. I've never seen the accounts, but probably they were running a pretty risky financial enterprise anyway, in terms of the the amount of money that they needed to spend versus kind of what they were able to earn. But it came to an end, and it came to an end very, very suddenly, in the middle of the Mirachandel exhibition, and bailiffs were brought in and everything. So it was a kind of very short, sharp, and slightly traumatic event. So that also meant that certain things didn't happen. So they were planning the next number of the Signals News Bulletin, which would have documented the exhibitions that had taken place immediately before. So one of the reasons why the exhibitions that happened in 1966 are less well remembered is because they didn't have a news bulletin to go with them. So there were a number of unrealized plans, as I've mentioned. But also, I would say that the unrealized plan was kind of part of business as usual, in a way. I'll just show you an example of what I mean. So on the back page of one issue, David puts down some plans for the next edition, and it feels like these were ideas that he had and others had that sounded excellent and experimental, but maybe weren't practically possible. So the idea would be edited by Gustav, that would include random concepts sent in by different people. That didn't happen, but perhaps the fact it didn't happen is okay and doesn't make it kind of not valid. It tells us now something about what more there was to this journal, what more possibilities were contained within them. I particularly like this one, which definitely didn't happen, which was a plan for a December issue that was kind of a bit Christmassy, which would be partly edited by school children, that would include a special supplement on kinetic carols by David Medalla, that would include many other things that that really didn't happen, and articles on modern ways of relaxation and spending one's leisure. I really wish that had happened, but maybe the notes or possibilities for it are somewhere hidden away we haven't come across. There were various kind of projects and schemes also contained within this news bulletin that never took place. And this again, this kind of counterfactual, possible, probable attitude in the news bulletin was something that, as I said, I felt gave me a permission to try out different possibilities when I organized the exhibition. And I think that now feels like a good time for me to stop, and I can see that some people have questions. So I'm gonna stop at that point. Are there any?
Yeah. Hello.
Hello?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. So that was amazing, and there's definitely some questions. I'll ask them directly. Maybe I'll just say them for everyone. So there's one question. I'll say two. So we first one is here. Sorry, from Tricky Lopa. She says that twice in the clippings that you shared, David Medalla was referred to as an elemental artist. What exactly does that mean? I think it was also the elemental statement or manifesto that also appeared there. And another one is, yeah.
He would have been kind of self-naming himself an elemental artist, because he did have an elemental art manifesto, and elemental was not a kind of permanent name that he gave to his work or his understanding of art, but it was one that I suppose related to the elements, as in the elements of the world. So again, it was something that might be associated with this idea of the invisible, the fact that the elements are not things that are necessarily visible to us, but a part of kind of our perceptual experience of reality in the world. So it was kind of the name shifted around, but elemental is also one that he would have used to refer to his work of the time as well.
There's a question from Randall Urbano. He's saying sorry. Yes, there was another question here. So Randall says, glad to see another clipping, perhaps of an English newspaper or magazine with a Jose Garcia Villa poem under the artist's name of a group show. Do you know any? Do you want to comment on that? Yeah.
Is it? Yeah. No, I mean, this is again. The news bulletin is kind of full of poems by artists of a different. Sometimes the poems are not in English, and they wouldn't necessarily have a direct connection with what they're published next to, but they would be people that David or others were aware of, and he would just kind of put them in certain parts of the news bulletin when he was laying it out. It's quite characteristic of how he approached it. So that, if nothing else, kind of explains why it's there. I don't know if that was exactly the question.
Yeah, or maybe Randall, you want to write to us a little bit more on Jose Garcia Villa and what you thought about it when you saw it. There's another question from Eva. Thanks, Isobel. I have two questions. One, have you found any more materials on Sounds 1? What was shown and how the connection with Ashmolean came about? The second one is the pictures that you showed of David's early bubble machines are very cubic, while later ones are rounded. Have you seen an evolution of the bubble machines form in archives on Signals?
The first question, no, I haven't consulted like the Ashmolean's archives about that exhibition, Soundings 1. But there is a tiny catalogue of it that shows the works. I would say why Oxford? It was partly to do with connections they could make to the arts club, which was a student-run arts club in Oxford. So kind of young people that were in part of that were in contact with people from Signals, and I presumably at that time, although I don't think it's possible now, the arts club would have been able to ask the Ashmolean to host the exhibition. In terms of the evolution of the shape of the bubble machines, the square ones were earlier, and I believe that the tubular form was more effective for producing the bubbles. But there isn't really any precise documentation in the bulletin about why that evolution took place or that change took place. But those ones with the square box-like construction were like a kind of the first prototype. But they're very, I'm not sure that any of them exist. I've never seen them in collections. Most of the ones that are in collections are the round ones. But to be honest, we would have quite liked to make a new square one, and we had quite a lot of fantasies about showing them outside, but it wasn't really possible at that time, partly because David was a little bit unwell. So yeah, but I don't know that much about exactly how that change took place, but I'm sure there are ways of finding it out.
There was recently, I'm not sure if it's from the collection itself, but there's a year and a half ago, there was a show of a survey of history of Filipino art at the Met Museum in Manila, and there was a squared one that
really?
was functioning. Yeah.
So maybe David and Adam were able
to place it. Yeah.
Yeah.
There, well, maybe I just had some immediate thoughts, and also a question around that amazing text of the statement around kinetic art. I'm curious if that was Medallas thinking of that it was more of a collective thinking, and also to tell us more perhaps on the sand machines and how that would be an example of the kinetic art that he would be interested in exploring. Yeah. When we were looking at his descriptions of these works, a lot of it were very biographical. I think it was one of the works that at some point he literally has written about kind of his daydreaming around being in the sun and the beaches in the Philippines, and it becomes this very very a work that is produced through affect, no, or
your first question. Well, I mean, this is some parts of the news bulletin, you can really feel like it's definitely David alone, but I would say this idea of the invisible is something quite collective, and the idea of the increasing sum of multiple creative endeavors is somewhere in between. The idea of the invisible was something that was very much developed by Guy Brett, but this idea of kinetic as the increasing sum of multiple creative endeavors, I would say that it feels like it's much more David, but it's also something that they almost needed to redefine what kinetic art was, because they were so obviously exceeding the traditional kind of conventional idea of it. It's not attributed to anyone, nothing in the news, but very little of the kind of editorial content is, but I think if anyone wrote those words, I would have thought it was David.
There's a question. No, go ahead about the sun.
Yeah, and in relationship to how they understood kinetic art, that's what you asked me, right? So yeah, I mean, it moves, but at the same time, I think it has this idea of also being both technological and slightly anti-technological, slightly kind of not simple, but the type, I think would say all the type of machines that David produced were things you could imagine someone being able to produce themselves. So there's a sort of way in which how they work is quite apparent, rather than the kind of sophisticated invisible technology that we deal with today. But at the same time, there's a sense of how it produces these drawings that sort of disappear and reproduce again. So this idea of kind of impermanence that was part of how they were beginning to understand the kinetic as well, of what is made visible and what disappears. And so I feel like it also kind of incorporates an element of randomness and chance in terms of how it was, the story of how it was put together, in terms of what it does and how it behaves, not necessarily predictable, that is on an end of understanding kinetic art that might involve, particularly I would say that their engagement with Brazilian artists really pushed the kinetic in different directions, because art from Venezuela is already very associated with a quite conventional idea of the kinetic, but the Brazilian artists that they engaged with, I think changed. I think that was quite a big push for them to expand what they were doing.
There's a question from John Tain from Asia Art Archive. He's online from Hong Kong. He says, thank you for the deep dive into Signals as a gallery and a serial publication. You mentioned the connections to artists from Brazil and elsewhere. Could you say if there were other publication-based projects that Signals may have been in conversation with?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the material that members have in their archives comes from is publications that connect to groups like Null in the Netherlands and Zero. So there would have been some element of exchange with those wide artistic connected movements. They definitely would have sent material in, but then they also had zines and so on, by a lot of experimental poets in the UK as well, from various different parts of the UK. So I think that there would definitely have been both the circulation of the news bulletin to others, but also the receipt of a lot of material. So definitely from the publications produced by Null and Zero, but also some quite kind of homemade experimental poetry journals that come from this country and presumably from other countries. They republished poetry and pieces of writing from Brazil, from Venezuela, from Mexico, and sometimes in the original language. They didn't translate it, wouldn't have time to translate it. So I feel like they would have been in quite a kind of storm of printed matter. And as I say, I mean, the absence of a kind of organized archive yet makes it tricky to be precise about these things. But I don't think it would have been a one-way street. I noticed that recently David talked about how he learned how newspapers were made while he was in the Philippines. That it was an anecdote that he helped with producing a newspaper publication. So he kind of felt like he gained the principles of that by osmosis. But yeah, I mean, it was like a newspaper, and in that, and intended as a newspaper for the art world. But certainly those kind of different associations between images, you might also see in some of the publications that they were receiving at that point.
I mean, also in relation to the background of David, he incursion in the arts is first through literature and writing. So the writing becomes like the source now of thinking and creation and of intellectual production. There's, I was thinking also as you were talking about how his interest in the bulletin was also, well, you talk about two main things. One on bringing this relationship between art and science, and one thing that also stood out was how he was interested in the networking, as we call it today, but literally like connecting people, trying to understand. And this is an age before the internet, before social media. And this newspaper becomes that platform of connectivity. They were interested in deciphering the physics around interconnectivity and also trying to decipher the social interaction, interconnectivity between their peers and the networks that they were building. And I think that that was definitely some kind of like a pioneering work of like thinking of a world that now we're so adjust because, as you said, our invisible way of dealing with technology, that we have embodied all of these gadgets and objects and apps, that now we're actually blind to not even understand how things move. And somehow the archaic movement of seeing sand being pushed is such a beautiful element to help us think around this technological world. I was also, I don't know, imagining that what happens if, because nowadays with the pandemic, there is somehow a global a collective global turn towards science, or at least medical science, trying to understand it. Like collectively, I think that there hasn't been in the past decades, it's like global interest of of hearing press conferences of medical people. No, so I wonder if it would be interesting to know if in the future artists may produce publications where they publish art, but they also publish the latest vaccine research. I don't know.
I can imagine. I mean, it is like at this time there was a thing called popular science, at least in the UK and in other places, where people were like genuinely interested in, and obviously like public television was better and things like that. But people were really interested. Like people would tune in and watch scientific development. But now it does feel like we all, like a lot of us have become kind of amateur virologists, and we're I don't know, I read scientific papers trying to decode the virus and that kind of thing, but also the visuality of it. I think people and artists are interested in like this visualization of the virus that has transpired as this kind of hideous, amazing thing, and how people want to see it as well. I think there's this kind of fascinating way in which people want to see it. They want to know what it looks like so they can have someone to blame perhaps, but also just so that they can kind of really understand how it works. So yeah, I don't think it's impossible that, and in many ways, maybe it's necessary, not only in terms of the pandemic, but also in terms of questions of environmental science, that there is more interconnectivity between how artists might engage with questions about the climate or about other kind of social science, social dimensions of science, in a way that they actually want to kind of communicate some of the facts of certain scientific areas. That it doesn't seem beyond imagining that the sudden kind of popular engagement with science of epidemics and viruses won't somehow affect how we think about art and how we share art with people.
Sorry. Yes, I'm gonna ask you something else, but while I do that, can you unshare your screen? While people could double click on your image to see you wider on Zoom. But I wanted to push you to speak also something outside of signals. I know it wasn't part of the framework, but it's related to also something that might be very pertinent for today. And David Medalla was very involved. Sorry, excuse me. One second. Sorry. David Medalla was involved in the democracy movements from working from London, but primarily an international agenda related on one hand to the coup in Chile, but in general, like this collective internationalism around fascist or anti-fascism. And we are living clearly in a moment, of a new ultra-right, a new resurgence of fascism. And maybe you don't have to tell us, react to the present, but tell us a little bit more about what was that democracy movement in which David Medalla was very involved in. Apologies for the background sound.
The Artists for Democracy, which came after, so the next phase after Signals was the Exploding Galaxy, which was kind of a collective performance, you might call it, but also they lived together, they shared a place. And after that, Artists for Democracy. So, I mean, it was part of something that is kind of remarkable, actually, that when the coup happened in Chile in '73, it was also such a kind of emotionally devastating event for the left in the UK. So there was, it sent shockwaves around the kind of anyone to the left, because it was like the only functioning socialist democracy that could be sort of seen as a model. So Artists for Democracy happened at that time and as a significant part of that response. And again, I mean, it was some of the most important contexts were kind of younger people. So the exhibition and conference that happened at Royal College of Art. But also, I think there's just a necessary, you can sort of feel it now, that when things that have to be done, when situations are urgent, you have to kind of shift a little bit how you deal with them as an artist. You have to think about them in different ways. And I think by that time, it was really apparent that in some ways, I suppose, that those involved in Signals wanted to honor their commitment to that part of the world. You can't just kind of like engage with it on some terms when everything is kind of beautiful and promising and then turn your back. So I think it was sort of also a continuation of that sense of commitment. And I think that probably people are just starting to view their own, if you like, kind of the micro politics of their engagement with other countries and places and people and artists of color, artists from particular nations in a slightly different way. And I think it was, it was part of that as well, that relationship for those who were in Signals and continue to engage with Latin America and other parts of the global South was lifelong. It wasn't kind of opportunistic in any sense. It was very, very lasting, and it still is. So I think that when you have that kind of commitment to people and places, the behavior that with which you, or the expression or the connections or the works that you do with that commitment will change when those situations are in a difficult position. And I think that maybe now, I hope that it would be possible for people to, or I mean, kind of in an institutional context, it's becoming more possible for artists and arts professionals to kind of honor those commitments, I think, in the ways that seem appropriate now. Yeah, thank you for that. I can't hear you, Inti.
Yes, I believe people can see the screen that I'm sharing. Just to give a reference of what Isobel was mentioning, the artist movement for democracy that in London had a very active presence with manifestations on different squares, such as this one where uh, you can see the portrait of the ousted socialist president Allende. And just to get a reference, maybe for people who are listening that are from younger generations, and it's definitely interesting to see how in your presentation, I think the political was brought from that article of Vietnam, but it later on became more strong with this movement in the 70s. There's
Yeah.
go ahead.
Just going to say a thing I didn't mention is, of course, at this point, there were also artists from Chile in exile, and not only Chile, also Brazil by this point as well. So that is a significant part of it. Those who came, those who left their countries of origin.
Last question from Bea. She says, thank you for this, Isobel. Are there accessible references for those interested to dig further, also to help educate art practitioners in kinetic art and initiatives like these?
Yeah, in fact, I mean, maybe what I could do is I put my email at the end of my presentation. If you want to email me, that please do, and I can send you some things. I can send you the longest thing I wrote recently was for this book, London Art World, so I can send you that in terms of signals, but also just maybe some other things that you might want to look at online. So you can email me, and then I'll send them to Inti and Desi as well, if in case other people ask for them. Yeah, I mean, I think that I hope one day there'll be some kind of organized archive of signals. It's a bit of yeah. It ended very explosively, so that makes the kind of memory of it really complicated. But yeah.
Well, yeah, thank you, Isobel. I think for everybody who logged in here and on Facebook and whoever watches the recap afterwards, we are very grateful that you participate. It's definitely a very difficult time in the Philippines and in the world, but especially in the Philippines in the past weeks. And we appreciate people's time and to concentrate on research and ideas and to keep on stimulating our minds, basically, which we shouldn't forget that that's what we had been doing. And it's definitely I think an incredible moment in time that you brought, Isobel, and how you've connected things. So thank you very much. And again, I'm announcing something that will be a second part with Isobel, which is a more intimate encounter of exchange for those people who are studying or have graduated recently in art history or related studies. Please log into our website. We've made an open call to have this one-on-one encounters based on the research of each participant. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much. Thank you, Inti. Thank you, Desi. And I don't know who is there, but thank you. I was too busy talking to even look who listening. But I think like Inti says, it's really nice to just have these moments in between everything that's happening in the Philippines here. Everywhere in different ways, no?
Yeah.
Some places worse than others.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.